Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon to all. The first thing that I would like to say is that I speak this afternoon in private capacity, not in official capacity. So disclaimer, first of all, I'm not representing any organization to which I'm affiliated with. I was thoroughly entertained by the goodly gentleman who spoke before me. If you all notice, he continued the story up to the point of reaching Havana, Cuba. He didn't talk anything about when he was in Havana, Cuba, and the good boy behavior, etc. But most presentations, I'd like to thank, first of all, the organizers for inviting me here this afternoon to be able to present my topic to such a diverse audience. I look around the room and I see folks who I know very well, economists, finance persons, students who I've taught, even folks in the media, event managers, everyone. So I'm happy to see that we have such a diverse crowd to speak on a topic which is of paramount importance in the context of Guyana. Human capital development is certainly something, well, human capital, first of all, as all the speakers before me alluded to, is definitely something which is on the cards for everyone. Now, there are two aspects of the presentations that have gone before me which have guided part of what I would like to describe. The goodly gentleman before me, he spoke on certain articles of the Constitution which enshrine health and well-being and so on, to which I'll allude to certain sections later as my presentation goes on. And then the question which was raised by Professor Mohammed, I know her as Dr. Paloma from our days on UG Council, before becoming professor and DVC and so on. But yes, the question on resource allocation in Guyana. So my presentation this afternoon, for those of you who know me, you know that I like to speak, especially on issues like this, but I'll try my best to be very brief considering the time constraint, etc. But note that I in no way can fully exhaust the nature of this presentation given the time constraint. But let's start first of all with what we're talking about here. We're having a green conversation, and premised on the green conversation is that of the Green State Development Strategy. Now, where does the Green State Development Strategy draw its inspiration from? Of course, the newly manifested Sustainable Development Goals. And it's important, first of all, to understand that the Sustainable Development Goals, in a general sense, the goals refer to a new pathway of international development, which have evolved from what was previously the Millennium Development Goals, right? So now we are looking at more, what I'd like to say, multidimensional or multi-pronged approach, or a multi-pronged approach to development strategy. So Guyana, in keeping with the international architecture of the Sustainable Development Goals, we are seeking to embark on the Green State Development Strategy, which of course is divided into 7 thematic areas. One of those thematic areas, and rightfully so, is that of human capital development. But what I think is very important is for us to understand that in this push for environmental conservation and such the like, what is very important is that of development. It's a Green State Development Strategy, something which is supposed to be able to, in its form and substance, drive economic growth and by extension, economic development. The two, of course, being two very distinct things. Economic growth being your rate of growth, or the rate at which your GDP expands per year, your gross domestic product. Economic development referring to the way that society of itself develops in terms of its well-being, if I'm to put it in a most layman terms. But what I find in contemporary discussions is something which is very unidimensional, and that is the nature of how we measure, our metrics which we use. Now, if we look at the way that Guyana's national accounting system is set up, we still focus a lot of efforts on GDP, on what we know as hard metrics to development, metrics which are focused on industrial output, metrics which are focused on rate of expansion, metrics which are focused on exchange rates, balance of payments, surplus in, and we can go on and on with the usual development mantra. But one would have to ask, is this metric considering the nature of human capital? What really is happening to our people? You see, Peter Drucker has a famous statement, you can't manage what you can't measure. So if we are going to speak primarily about human capital development, one of the things which needs to come to the forefront of our discussion is the metric which we are using. So therefore, on a national scale, we have to begin to speak in different terms other than 2.1% growth rate last year, 3% growth rate projected next year. Tell me more tangible things. Let us talk about our level of equality. Let us talk about our level of participation, household equality. Are we including the contribution of women in the national output? Are we measuring the nature of gender equality in workplaces? Are we looking along that sort of progressive route? Those are critical questions which one must ask if we are going to examine development in that way. So if one looks at the derivation of gross domestic product, it's from an era where you have a lot of industrialization happening, all right? A lot of industrial production, etc. But by the time you reach to the 1960s, 1970s, 80s, in the development theory, like my good friend here mentions Amartya Sen, the speaker before me mentions Amartya Sen. Here we're reaching to what is called capitalism with a human face. Here we see scholars such as Amartya Sen coming forward with Human Development Index. You have talking about capabilities approach. You have 1976, the ILO at their international conference coming up with something called Basic Needs Strategy. All right, so you begin to see a turn in a development context in terms of the metrics which are used. However, we still remain along the line of primarily utilizing output and gross domestic product for our metrics. Because of the time constraint, I can go very much, I can go in detail in this, but I'll limit it to that for you to just think about it the next time when we're referring to the conversation of development. What metric are we using? So if a country, for example, in the 1920s, Stalinist Russia, was experiencing unprecedented rates of growth, 28%, 35%, no other market-driven type of economy has been able to experience such a rate of industrial production. But what about the lives of people in Stalinist Russia? Therefore, one must necessarily examine the social conditions which are prevailing and not just the economic conditions. Now, that might sound strange coming from a person of my field, training in economics, finance, that sort of thing. But as you delve deeper and deeper into political economy, which is the birthstone actually of economics, the study of contemporary economics, and you read scholars such as Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, even if you read Karl Marx, etc., you'd see that what the principal question of it was, it's about how do we make people's lives better? And that in form and substance is the pervasive question of economic study and understanding development. So in that regard, I'd want to come to the question which was raised, or the notion which Professor Mohammed left off. And I find it to be very interesting because it speaks to elements of, we're talking here about resource allocation. It speaks to elements of what is known as distributive justice. Right? John Rawls, in his 1974 book on Theory of Distributive Justice, writes quite an extensive essay or treatise on contemporary distributive justice. Now, distributive justice refers to a socially just allocation of resources. When we take that framework and we put it into the context of Guyana, one must necessarily ask the question, based on our current framework, do we have mechanisms for the impending oil and gas boom to filter down to all of the common man? What is our current mechanism? The last time I presented in this room, I presented on the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the the instrument through which all of the revenues are supposed to be deposited. The Green State Development Strategy is then supposed to take that money and allocate it accordingly, and then it's supposed to be expended through what? The government mechanism for expenditure, right? The government mechanism for expenditure. Now, currently, when we examine the government mechanism for expenditure, we're talking here about the national budget, the annual budget which the government presents. Now, I'd want to say something regarding public financial management in this country. If you examine the nature of what it is fundamentally different from what is enshrined in our articles of our Constitution. What we have every year is a government functionary in the form of the Minister of Finance. This is across administrations, across political parties, going and presenting ad nauseum a 4-hour, 3-hour presentation on development in the country, or how the government intends to expend billions of dollars, impact the welfare and the lives of people. But how much do you feel involved in that process? That is something which is, of course, critical. Now, when one examines, my good friend here who spoke before me made reference to the fundamental or inalienable rights of men in terms of health care, right, in the Articles of Constitution. But I'd like to point to Article 13 of the General Principles of the Constitution, which says, the principal objective, and I want you guys to remember this always, the principal objective of the political system of the state is to establish an inclusionary democracy by providing increasing opportunities for the participation of citizens and the organizations in the management and decision-making processes of the state, with particular emphasis on those areas of decision-making that directly affect their well-being. So when one examines what is enshrined within our Constitution as a principle as to how development is to be approached, and then one examines the major arm of how development happens in the country, we see that there is diametric opposition. So many persons in the country feel as if a national budget is hoisted upon them, or it is superimposed upon them. But when one looks at what the article of the Constitution sets out, it is supposed to be an inclusionary process. And these are processes which systems in the United States of America and other developed countries, they have been able to master. You've been able to put forward a bill, have your senator or your congressman take the bill, and then, you know, it's more people-oriented, more what you call bottom-up approach to development, at least not in the United States in certain administrations. But in a general sense, the system must be able to provide for that. And those are questions that one necessarily needs to ask if we are going to speak about development, especially with a such an impending boom coming, right? Now, I did some rough numbers. I've modeled all of Guyana's oil revenue, etc. And it's very interesting, because if we continue along based on current discoveries, our national budget might triple or quadruple within just 5 to 6 years. And if our mechanism for public spending remains in a manner which ostracizes the common man, then how do we speak to inclusionary or participatory decision and budget processes, etc.? So from an economic development perspective, we see that there are certain flaws within our current framework for ensuring participation. So that is, when you look at it, it's rooted within Rawls's 1971 theory of distributed justice as a philosophical or overarching basis. The final point which I'd want to make, and it would be remiss of me to not touch on it in a developing country's context, is that of migration. If I'm going to speak on human capital and be absent of the notion of migration, I would be doing the subject or the field of human capital a great injustice. In Guyana, as you know, we have many, many problems with our migration rate, especially that of our educated and talented persons. You know, when I undertook once to model economic growth of Guyana. And the largest contributor to national prosperity in this country is the development of its people. One, the amount that you expend on education that directly reaches the person, that directly reaches to the individual, and the next one is the rate of growth of our educated working population, which over time has stayed relatively stagnant due to high migration rates. As you know, the last World Bank report, which reported on education migration, cited around 90 to 91% of all educated persons, and they have their own definition of educated persons, migrating from Guyana, which means we have around 9 to 10% remaining. Now, if that is the greatest contributor to our national development, and we have such a vast migration, then the question begs, where are we going? Now, I'd like to say one last thing, and this will inject spheres of political economy discussion in a contemporary developing country framework, is that of what role does instances like corruption, nepotism, etc., play in driving migration. So of course, as you guys know from maybe basic social studies in secondary school, there are pull factors to migration. But what is hardly examined are those push factors to migration in underdeveloped countries. Now, I want you to take a simple example, and those of you who perhaps work in the public sector may know what I'm speaking about. You go to the University of Guyana, you work very hard, you earn a distinction pass in a very relevant field, perhaps economics, and you go, you work or you're able to secure a scholarship. You go do a year or 2 years in Britain or in one of the developing countries, India, China, and you learn quite a bit. Now you're bursting with energy to come back to Guyana. But then when you come back to Guyana, you're injected into a public administration system. You feel the burning desire to contribute to your country. And this burning desire to contribute leads you to work in public service. Because of course, that's the first place people want to work. You want to contribute to your country. But then when you go into the public service, what happens if you, as an educated, bubbly, sprightly, energetic young person, has to report to somebody who has been placed in charge of you, who is, let's say, less than apt in dexterity for the job, if we are to put it in that way, right? What happens in that case? So what happens in that case? Now, these are where, this instances such as these, and we can take that framework and repeat it for a multitude of instances. Instances such as those can be found languishing across the public administration system in Guyana. And that's just one single practical analogy, right? One single practical analogy. What do you think happens with that individual over time? The individual's energy goes. The individual feels as if he or she is not being promoted on the basis of merit, right? And therefore, if one looks at it, merit, incentives, and these principles are the ones which drive development. Persons have to feel an incentive to work. Persons must feel motivated. Persons must be able to see their way up the ladder, if we are to use colloquial expression. And if we have instances of extreme corruption, extreme nepotism, and we throw away instances, or we throw away philosophies of meritocratic systems, and the incentive schema for development of society is destroyed, then how do persons stay? So what you will find to the individual who has done so well, the major contributor in the national development framework, the human capital, if we do not, in our policies and our considerations, craft specific policy direction to keep or retain our educated personnel, we can talk about all oil and gas, we can talk about all revenues, we can come up or concoct the most beautiful development plan. But if we don't have the educated workforce here, skilled, semi-skilled, unskilled, everyone has their part to play. But if we don't have that workforce here, which is being promoted on the basis of merit, etc., then you will find that you're really wind up with a major development problem. And perhaps, maybe that is one which holds the key to unlocking Guyana's underdevelopment quandary over the past few years. So with those few thoughts, I'd like to leave you guys with a couple of things to ruminate on. And of course, you can let me know if there's a question and answer segment. I'd be more than happy to answer questions or provide comments. Thank you.